right, Ray, if you could figure out how to turn the lights down a little bit more, that would be great, but I'm not sure how to do it. And it's a pleasure to be here. I've been here since January 1st. The family just came August 1st. We let our kids finish out the school year in Virginia. Yeah, that's much better. All right, now you can hear me. So the family got here August 1st, and the poor kids had a really short summer because we get out of school really late. I'm going to move this down just a little bit. Can you all hear me okay still? Okay. Kids get out really late in Virginia, so we get out late, and then we came up August 1st, and the poor kids had to start school like 3 days later. But they're adjusting well, and we're enjoying Western Kentucky very much. It's really a pleasure to be here in taking Dr. Lacefield's position. Dr. Lacefield's kind of the legend in the forages arena. I mean, those are pretty big shoes to fill, and I'm not sure I'm going to fill them, but I'm going to try to do a good job in Western Kentucky and promote grazing and incorporation of livestock back into farming in Western Kentucky as well as I can. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to you a little bit about the role of soil fertility and grazing management in weed control in pastures. When we talk about weed control in pastures, we really need to think about it from an integrated approach. If we just talk about one aspect of weed control, whether it's using an animal or soil fertility or using a herbicide, chances of you being successful with a weed control program in pastures is pretty slim. The other myth I want to dispel is that we're ever going to get rid of weeds in pastures. That's just not going to happen. Best we can hope for is to manage those weeds in some kind of way that's going to benefit us and our animals in the environment as a whole. So in today's topic, today's presentation, I'm going to touch on a couple topics and just a little bit about defining weeds, talking about an integrated approach to weed control, and we'll talk about a number of different aspects, and then we'll kind of finish up and focus in on soil fertility and grazing management as part of an integrated weed control program in pastures. So this is Dr. Scott Haygood, and he was our weed specialist at Virginia Tech for many, many, many years, as long as I was there. And when I think of an extension specialist, Scott was truly an extension specialist. I mean, just great in front of groups, great talking about weeds and pastures, and he was a herbicide guy. But the first thing he would tell you, I was never on a pasture weed program with Scott where he didn't stand up and say, look, if you're solely depending on herbicides for weed control in pastures, you're going to fail. You've got to have an integrated approach. You've got to choose the right forage species. You've got to have good soil fertility and good grazing management. Scott said that every time that we were on a weed control program together. So it's important to realize when we talk about weed control, we have to have that integrated approach to really be successful. So just a little bit on defining weeds. If you look at a really broad definition of a weed, it's a plant that's just out of place. So if I was a corn plant in a soybean field, I'd be a weed. In pastures, it's a little bit different. In the definition I kind of like for pastures is a weed or a plant I can't figure out how to get my cows to eat somehow. That's really what a weed is in a pasture. If you ever look at your pastures, we always think of them as monocultures or simple mixtures, but really there's a diverse number of plant species in that pasture. And if you watch your animals in the spring, they're grazing all kinds of things that we would normally consider a weed, all kinds of what I call a weedy forb in the spring. This is just a chart from a publication that Dr. Ozzie Abay did at Virginia Tech, and she looked at the nutritive value of different weeds. And these are in the vegetative stage. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute, but a lot of these different species compare very favorably in terms of in vitro dry matter digestibility and crude protein to alfalfa. So this notion that weeds have no nutritional value is not exactly true. And weeds are no different than other forage plants. As they mature, they lose nutritional value. And that's what this graph shows here. This is for forages, but as this plant matures from vegetative to mature, we see a decrease in digestibility, we see a decrease in palatability, and we see a decrease in dry matter intake. Weeds are no different than this. They follow the same trend. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because if we manage pastures and we start to implement rotational stocking and we're keeping that pasture in a vegetative state, then we're also starting to manage the weeds that are in that pasture too and keeping them more vegetative, and will hopefully increase their nutritional value and palatability so that we can get animals to graze them as we go through the grazing season. So rotational stocking benefits not only the forages by keeping them in a more vegetative state, but also weeds that we may have in our pastures. Scott's going to show you some, I can't remember, Scott or Michael will show you some more of this data later on this afternoon, but this was a project done by Kevin Bradley at the University of Missouri, and they'll show you more detail on this, but essentially what Kevin did was he sprayed half this pasture with an herbicide, and he didn't spray half the pasture with an herbicide, and then he looked at where the animals were grazing, and the way he looked at where the animals were grazing was with GPS collars on the cows. Each one of those points represents a location where those cows were. Essentially what he found was that the majority of the grazing occurred where he had applied that herbicide. For whatever reason, we caused the animals to prefer the area of the pasture where that herbicide was applied. And plants have, different reasons animals don't graze them. Sometimes they're physical barriers, although Kathy just told us that she's found that physical barriers like thorns had very little effect on grazing. And then there's chemical barriers like tannins and Sericea lespedeza that makes it less palatable for the animal. So I want to talk just a little bit, not much, about selecting forage species for our part of the world. When we look for forage species for grazing systems, the number one characteristic on my list is regionally adapted. Why is this so important in terms of a weed control program? Because we want something that's going to grow in that pasture that's going to be very competitive with weeds in that pasture. So we want something that's well adapted to where we're trying to grow it at. And you're saying, well, that kind of makes sense, but who wouldn't grow something that was regionally adapted? When I lived in Virginia, I saw a lot of people move to the south side of Virginia from New York or northeast Ohio or northwest Pennsylvania, and they would come down and they would bring their forage species along with them. And over the years, I saw some real disasters. People would plant things that did well in New York, but wasn't really well adapted to the south side of Virginia. And when that happens, that plant is not going to be persistent in that grazing system. So when it's not persistent, what happens? It starts to thin out, and what do we have in the pasture? We've got a bare spot, right? What grows in a bare spot? A weed. A good Lord doesn't let a soil go bare very long. And he puts a Band-Aid on it, and usually that Band-Aid is a weed. Sometimes the Band-Aid's pretty palatable, sometimes it's not real palatable, depending on what that Band-Aid is. So other things to consider is the type of soils you have. Just because alfalfa's well adapted to Kentucky doesn't mean it's adapted to every soil on your farm. So if you've got low-lying soils that tend to be wet-natured, alfalfa's not a good choice for that because it doesn't like wet feet. So the forage species has to match your region and the type of soil on your farm. You want to be persistent and tolerant of grazing and so on, but those first two are really, really important to consider when selecting a forage species. And there's lots of data like this. In that little pocket guide you got, there's some tables in there that show the different adaptation of different forage species. In Southern Forages, there's a really good table that's the larger version of this little book here. I'm not going to go through all these today, but I just wanted to show you that this information is available when you're thinking about different forage species for a grazing system. When we talk about forage species that are adapted to Kentucky, love it or hate it, we've got tall fescue. It's by far our best adapted cool season grass. And a lot of times we view it as a curse in our grazing systems, but I would say we need to think of it as a blessing. As much as people moan and complain about tall fescue, the simple fact of the matter is it's weaned more calves in Kentucky than any other single grass. And the fact is we need to start to think about how do we incorporate it successfully into grazing systems. And there's lots of different practices that we can use to help us incorporate tall fescue and manage it within a grazing system. Some things are like incorporating legumes, using better fertility management, better grazing management to manage tall fescue within the grazing system. But at the end of the day, that's one of our best adapted grasses, and we have to figure out how to incorporate it into our system successfully. One of the other very important factors in terms of a weed control program on our farms is setting a sustainable stocking rate. So what does that mean? That means the number of animals that you have for the entire year on that farm. And this is a nice diagram. It's adapted from an old publication from Gerald Mott. And what it shows us that as our stocking rate increases, what happens to animal performance, which is the dotted line, and then animal production per acre. So as we start to increase our stocking rate, our animal performance actually goes down because there's less for the animals to eat, and they can be less selective in their grazing, so animal performance decreases. But animal performance per acre increases, or our productivity per acre increases in terms of how much animal we're producing per acre. Where we want to be is where those two lines cross at, kind of in this blue zone. That's our optimal zone. Now, when our stocking rate creeps up so high that we get past this optimal zone, then the whole system kind of crashes and burns. And this is when we can really get a lot of weed problems in pastures, because what happens is that we reduce pasture productivity, so our productivity per acre goes down because there's nothing for those animals to eat, and we reduce animal performance. When we get in that situation by having too high of a stocking rate, what happens to our pastures? They're grazed like this tabletop, and we open that stand up, and when we open that stand up, weeds come into that stand. What's a good place to start in terms of the stocking rate for cow-calf operations in Kentucky? You know, of course, I'm in extension, so I'm going to say it depends, right? But it does depend. It depends on the productivity of your soil. It depends on your pasture management skills. It depends on your soil fertility, and so on. But in general, if we're somewhere between 2 and 3 acres per cow-calf unit, we're going to have a pretty sustainable system. As you push down towards 2, then you've got to have some pretty good grazing management to maintain healthy pastures. As we get up towards 3, then we really have a great opportunity to extend our grazing season and reduce the amount of conserved forage that we feed within our grazing system. And that conserved forage can be pretty expensive. In fact, it accounts for about 50% of the total cow-calf budget, which is another talk completely. All right, another part of integrated weed control in pastures is clipping pastures. And Michael Flesner will talk a little bit more about this, but I just wanted to mention it. If we're using clipping as a weed control strategy, you've got to do it in a timely manner. So what happens when we do it in late summer after those plants have all gone to seed? Are we doing much good? Well, we're spreading seed for next year, right? So it's got to be done before those plants go to seed. We can incorporate it as part of a grazing system. So if we're managing tall fescue, we know that the toxins in tall fescue tend to accumulate in the seed head of the plant. So by going in there and grazing those as that seed head moves up through the stem when that plant's joining, we can reduce the toxicity of tall fescue in our summer pastures. And at the same time, maybe we'll help with our weed control too. One thing to think about when you clip pastures is that there's a cost associated with it. And you can argue about this cost. Maybe the economists were wrong. Maybe it's not $15 per acre. Maybe it's $10 an acre to clip a pasture. But there is a cost associated with it. And you have to consider that. Sometimes that cost, if we clip a pasture 2 or 3 times a year, can be pretty significant. And it may justify using a herbicide in that pasture if we're just clipping pastures for a weed control strategy. I like to think about costs for clipping pastures not on an acre basis, but on a cow basis, because we're getting paid for producing that calf. So if we clip pastures twice a year, I mean, we could be looking at around $30 an acre or $30 per cow for pasture clipping. Herbicide use, and we're going to have two great speakers who are going to talk about incorporating herbicides into an integrated weed control program. And there are some very, very effective herbicides out there, and Scott Flynn and Michael Flesner will talk about those. And they'll talk about how to successfully use a herbicide. It's just not as easy as spraying a herbicide in a pasture. You really need to identify your weed that you want to control so you know what it is, and then match it up with the correct herbicide and apply it at the right time and use the right spray volume and surfactants and so forth. One thing that we have to realize is that when we use herbicides, they're not going to target just one single broadleaf weed in a pasture. They're going to kill most of our broadleaf weeds, even the ones that could be beneficial within our grazing system, and they're also going to kill clover. So we have to make that decision when weeds get to a point. We don't have a lot of great data on this. When they get to what we call the economic threshold, when we're justified at killing the clover and all the other beneficial broadleaf weeds in our pastures to get control of those really big problem weeds. We can use spot applications and things like this roto wiper or wicking wheat herbicides onto weeds, tall growing weeds and pastures can be very successful. Not as good as broadcasting that spray, but can be pretty successful. And again, herbicides alone are not the answer. Like any other single practice that we're going to talk about today, they're a tool that we can use in an integrated weed control program in pastures. That's just actually a sweet gum tree that we wicked some remedy and glyphosate onto in a pasture and got pretty good control on it. Not perfect control. We didn't get control like that on every sweet gum tree in the pasture, but it was fairly good control where we got good coverage on those. So what I want to do now is kind of focus in on forage plant growth and grazing management as part of an integrated weed control strategy and talk a little bit about that. And like Ray said, this is going to be beneficial to you whether you're using it from a weed control strategy standpoint or just a pasture productivity standpoint. And then we'll finish up by talking about soil fertility as part of an integrated weed control program. So when we talk about grazing management, there's lots of different things we can call it. We can call it rotational stocking, we can call it management intensive grazing, mob grazing, rotational stocking, and the list goes on and on. But essentially what we're talking about is managing two things in that pasture: how close we graze that pasture and how long we rest that pasture between grazing events. That's really what managed or controlled grazing is about. And the idea is that we're going to maintain a healthy and vigorous sod in that pasture through good grazing management. And our best defense against weeds in pastures is to have something growing well in that pasture that we want. When we don't have something growing well in that pasture that we want, something else is going to grow there, usually a weed that we don't want. The other thing that I like to mention about rotational stocking is that we tend to increase the productivity and drought tolerance of that pasture. And that's probably something we don't talk enough about. When we look through the literature, there was a nice summary of the literature a few years ago, and they found that on average, rotational stocking increased pasture productivity by about 30%. That doesn't happen overnight, so you don't put a fence up and start rotational stocking, and the next day you got 30% more forage. In grazing systems, it takes several grazing seasons to see the benefit of these management practices. The other thing that people notice when they switch from a continuous to a rotational stocking system is that their plants tend to grow, the pastures tend to grow longer into a drought stress and come out of that drought stress faster. And that's related to several things that we'll talk about, but one is the energy stores in that plant, and the second one is the root system of that plant. It's important to remember what we do to the top of that plant impacts what's under the ground, and we're going to talk about that in just a few slides. Another benefit of rotational stocking is stronger nutrient cycles within our grazing system, and we're going to talk about nutrient cycling and soil when we talk about soil fertility. And then is managing botanical composition of our pastures. And grazing management, one of the things we don't talk enough about is that it's really a powerful tool for shifting the botanical composition of pastures. So just how we graze those pastures can impact what plants are dominant within that pasture, and we'll give you some examples of that as we move on today. And I always like to tell people, you know, a lot of times when we start to talk about rotational grazing, we scare people away by saying, well, you got to install 5 miles of water line and 32 different waters and all this electric and temporary fencing. That's not exactly true. I mean, those are all good tools, don't get me wrong. But we can start a rotational grazing system on most farms just by closing a couple gates. And when we close a couple gates, all of a sudden we've got 2 pastures instead of 1, and we can rotate them back and forth. Next thing we know, well, it looks like it's helping a little bit, so we can take those 2 pastures, maybe we divide them into 3, and so on, and it kind of builds upon itself. But what I don't want you to do is get scared away from using rotational stocking because you think you've got to make this huge investment. The investment's really in management and just closing a few gates, and next thing you know, you've got a little bit of a rotational grazing system. Whenever I talk about forage plant growth, I always like to start with the most important biochemical process on Earth. If it wasn't for this process, photosynthesis, none of us would be sitting here today. So this is a really important process for us as grazers, but for everybody as just as human beings on this Earth. So what this process does is take light energy from the sun and essentially convert it into chemical energy, and we do that through the plant. And it goes through this process. This will be on the quiz later. I'm just kidding, and we're not going to give you a quiz. But carbon dioxide and water, so carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, is converted into sugars and carbohydrates in the plant through photosynthesis. And a very important byproduct for us is oxygen. And this all happens in a specialized part of the plant cell called the chloroplast. Chlorophyll is what gives that plant a green color. And the whole process is driven by light energy from the sun. It's really an amazing process when we think about it. I like to think about our farms as kind of a big solar panel. You know, whether we're a row crop farm or a pasture, we want to maximize the amount of green leaf area on that farm. We want every square inch of that farm covered by green leaf area as many days of the year as we possibly can. And that's going to optimize productivity of our pastures. Now, how we manage our pastures impacts this solar panel, right? So if I'm continuously grazing my pasture down to the soil surface, how big is our solar panel going to be? Pretty small, right? So if I start to manage my grazing and I don't graze it quite as close, then the size of my solar panel is going to be much bigger as we move forward, and that's going to enhance the productivity of that pasture, and it's going to increase the regrowth rate of that pasture. Sometimes I'll talk about photosynthesis from this what I call the factory model. But my wife's a horse owner, and she likes this one better than the chemical equation. But if we think of it from the factory standpoint, the factory in the photosynthetic process is the plant leaf. And like any other factory, when we produce a product, which happens to be sugars and carbohydrates in this particular model, we need raw materials. And those raw materials are sunlight, water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide. They go into the factory, we produce our product, sugars and carbohydrates, and we've got an important byproduct from our photosynthetic plant in terms of oxygen. Those products, those sugars and carbohydrates, can go 2 places in the plant. They can go for growth and maintenance of the plant. That's what I call the consumer outlet. That always gets first billing in the plant. So all of our products, sugars and carbohydrates, get shifted to growth and maintenance of the plant until we're meeting those needs. Only when our photosynthetic factory is making enough product that there's extra, do the extras get shifted into the warehouse where they're stored up in that plant. And different plants store their carbohydrates in different places. We'll show you that in the next slide. That warehouse is really important in plants. When we keep that full and that plant has good carbohydrate reserves or good energy reserves in the plant, it's much more resilient in the face of stress. So when I graze that plant down and it needs some extra energy to regrow, it can take energy from that warehouse and use it for regrowth of that plant. When I go through a drought stress and that plant's really stressed out and it needs to regrow after that drought stress, it can mobilize that energy from the warehouse and use it for growth after that drought stress. When I go through winter and I come out in the spring, if I've got a full warehouse, that plant's going to come out strong and grow earlier in the spring and be very productive. So, and I apologize, that's not a cow in that picture, that's my wife's horse. But horses are great grazers. Graze really close and really frequently in most horse pastures. And we've got a defoliation event taking place here. And the question always is if we have adequate moisture and we've got good soil nutrient levels in this particular pasture, what do we need for regrowth here? Any ideas? Green leaves, good. So what are they going to be doing? Capturing sunlight through photosynthesis, right? Very good. So the answer is energy. We've got to have energy for that plant to regrow with, and that energy is in the form of photosynthate from photosynthesis, or sugars and carbohydrates. And that comes from two places in the grass plant. It comes from leaf area remaining after grazing. So when I graze that pasture down, if I leave a little bit of leaf area, it's going to be able to capture more sunlight and help that pasture regrow faster. It also comes from stored carbohydrates in that plant, so that warehouse. And those stored carbohydrates are going to help propel regrowth after this grazing event here. So different plants store carbohydrates in different places. If we take, for example, orchard grass or tall fescue, they store their carbohydrates in the stem base. So that stem that's kind of close to the soil surface is where they store their carbohydrates. And you're saying, well, why do I care where they store their carbohydrates at? Well, it impacts how we manage that plant under grazing. So think about orchard grass, for example. So I'm grazing orchard grass down, and I graze it maybe a little bit closer than I should. What have I done to that photosynthetic factory? Is it big or small? Small, right? I removed the leaf area of that plant. So I removed its ability to capture sunlight because I grazed it a little bit too close. Where's orchard grass store its carbohydrates? In that stem base, right? So when I graze it really tight in a pasture, or I mow it tight when I'm making hay, and I remove that stem base, we're also removing some of those stored carbohydrates in that plant. So we're kind of putting a double whammy on that plant, right? Because we're removing its ability to capture sunlight, and we're removing its stored carbohydrates. So how do you think orchard grass is going to perform under close and frequent grazing? Not real well. Probably one of the worst things that happened to orchard grass is the invention of the disc mower. If you don't have your disc mower set right, you can cut really, really close with the disc mower. And orchard grass can't handle that kind of close defoliation height. So raising that defoliation height so that you're leaving 3 to 4 inches in an orchard grass stand when you mow it for hay is really important in stand persistence long term. So if we take something else like white clover has a growth habit where it has a lot of leaves very close to the soil surface. And so a lot of times in overgrazed pastures, we'll see white clover kind of persist in that pasture because it can tolerate that close defoliation because it's got its leaf area very close to the soil surface. It also stores its carbohydrates in a structure called a stolon. And the stolon is a modified stem that grows right along the soil surface, and that lets white clover spread out in a pasture and fill gaps in. So that stolon is safely below the grazing height of the animal. So its leaf area and its stored carbohydrates are below the grazing height of the animal, and that's why white clover can persist under close and frequent grazing. Now, does it mean that we can't use a plant like orchard grass in the pasture? Absolutely not. It just means that we need to manage it a little bit differently. So instead of grazing it right to the soil surface, we need to leave 3 to 4 inches of leaf area there in that pasture to capture sunlight after grazing and to leave those stored carbohydrates in place. Some people will say a little bit more than 3 to 4 inches. Sometimes people in grazing schools will say, you know, I think the regrowth is a lot faster at 4 to 5 inches of residual height after I graze through an orchard grass pasture. One thing that I'll mention real quick is that we always give these rules out like we're going to put our animals in that pasture and they're going to graze every bit of it to 3 to 4 inches, right? It doesn't quite work like that, right? So we're kind of working off of an average. Some places will be grazed a little closer, some a little bit further. But the thing we don't want to do is force the animals to eat everything down to 3 to 4 inches, because if we do that, they're going to overgraze a lot of other spots within that pasture. I'd like to talk a little bit about carbohydrate cycling in alfalfa, and CHO stands for carbohydrates. And all forage plants have a carbohydrate cycle, but it's most pronounced in alfalfa because alfalfa is 100% dependent on stored carbohydrates for regrowth. What's an alfalfa field look like after we mow it for hay? Now we can graze alfalfa too, right? But after we mow it for hay, what's it look like? Stems, just stems, right? Not a lot of green leaf area left in an alfalfa field. But it regrows fairly fast, so that energy for regrowth is coming from somewhere. And in alfalfa, it comes from stored carbohydrates. And those stored carbohydrates are in the taproot of the plant. And this is what we call the carbohydrate cycle. So this is the level of non-structural carbohydrates in the roots of alfalfa. So as we defoliate that plant and it starts to regrow, we see that we have a very drastic drop in stored carbohydrates in the alfalfa root system, and until that plant gets 6 to 8 inches tall. And then they start to go back up. Why are they going back up when that plant gets 6 to 8 inches tall? Right, so that photosynthetic factory is getting big enough that it's capturing more sunlight and making more sugars and carbohydrates than the plant needs for regrowth and maintenance. So the extra ones get shifted back into storage. By the time we get 28 to 30 days out, we're back up to pre-cut carbohydrate levels in the alfalfa plant. If you understand this cycle, you understand the whole idea behind rotational grazing. We graze it, we defoliate that pasture, we let it rest, and then we let it rebuild its carbohydrates back up. What would happen if we came in here and we let it get to 6 to 8 inches tall and they ate it off again? We get another decrease in carbohydrate levels, and another one and another one. And it won't kill that plant if you do it one time. But if you do it repeatedly, like you would find in a continuously stocked pasture, when those plants try to regrow, every time they try to regrow, the animal's right there and they nip that new growth off. Over time, we're going to draw the carbohydrate levels in those forage plants down. And when we do that, they come back slower. And eventually, the pastures will start to thin out. And what happens when pastures start to thin out? We get weeds in them, right? Something fills those gaps in. This, if you go home tonight and look at just one diagram from my talk today, look at this one again. If you understand this diagram, it's a little complex, I'm going to explain it, but if you understand this diagram, you understand the whole basis of rotational stocking. So this was from Dr. Roy Blazer at Virginia Tech. He was really a man ahead of his time. This was in one of his publications. He's passed away now. But this is a really important diagram when we talk about rotational stocking. If we take this diagram and we split it in half, the tillers on the right side of this diagram have a low carbohydrate status. That means they don't have a lot of carbohydrates and sugar stored up in the warehouse of that plant. And this was kind of what we would find in a continuously stocked pasture. When those plants regrow, every time they try to regrow, they get grazed off. If we look on the left-hand side, we have plants that have a high carbohydrate status. So those are pastures that get grazed, and then we rest them and let them build those carbohydrates back up. That's kind of be like a rotationally grazed pasture. And then we do two other things. We either leave 2 inches of residual leaf area, so that photosynthetic factory, or we cut it all off. And then we look at the plants when they regrow down here in the bottom. So if we look at the plants that had 2 inches of leaf area and a high carbohydrate status, they had 1 inch of regrowth in a given time period, and they formed 4 new tillers at the base of the plant, so 4 new grass plants coming out of the base of the plant. If we look at the opposite of that, no leaf area left and a low carbohydrate status, we got half as much regrowth in that same time period and fewer than half as many tillers formed. So This is the whole basis of rotational stocking. We want the warehouse to be full of carbohydrates, and we want to leave some leaf area. And when we do that, we're going to increase the productivity of that grass stand, also the density of that grass stand. And that's going to help in an integrated weed control program because it's going to exclude weeds from entering that sod. We talk a lot about what's going on above the soil, and I don't think we talk enough about what's happening below the soil. But one of the points I want to drive home this morning is that what we do, the top of that plant impacts what's below the ground. So if we look at a study by Dr. Kreider from the 1950s, a root growth stoppage study, what he found is when we removed 50% of the shoots, so say we had a sward that was 10 inches tall and we removed 5 inches of that, we temporarily stopped root growth. When we removed 90% of that growth on top, so if we had 10 inches, we removed 9 inches of it, we stopped root growth for 17 days. When we clipped those plants 3 times a week, root growth never resumed. So just think about that for 1 minute. And continuously stock pasture, what happens every time that plant regrows a little bit? The animals come in and clip it off. What do you think is happening to that root system below the ground surface? It's not getting bigger. It's not actively growing. And when we removed 40% of the less of the top of the plant, we tended not to stop root growth. So we got three grass plants here. We've got one that's continuously stocked here, one that's rotationally stocked, and one that's not used that much. What I want you to look at is the size, the difference in the root system. Which one of these plants are going to be more resilient when it comes to a drought? The one with the bigger root system, right? So the point that I want to make with this is what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the ground. And that's one of the benefits of rotational stocking we don't talk enough about, is we tend to increase drought tolerance in our grazing system by maintaining a healthy root system in that plant. Is it a silver bullet? No, it's not a silver bullet. If it doesn't rain for 3 months, both pastures are going to be under drought stress, but rotationally stocked pastures tend to grow longer into a drought stress and come out of that drought stress faster. All right, I want to switch into the last part of my presentation. That's looking at the role of soil fertility in a integrated weed control program. I just want to start out and kind of define what a soil is. And we commonly think of a soil as inorganic. So sand, silt, and clay. And a loam soil would be equal parts of sand, silt, and clay. But in reality, soils have lots of other things, and they have organic matter. They've got gases and liquids and living organisms, and we kind of don't talk enough about the living part of the soil. And all these things together serve as a medium for plant growth. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but what I want people to realize is that a healthy pasture soil has lots of living things in it. If we look, for example, below the ground here, we have about 2,500 pounds of plant roots per acre in a healthy pasture. And we have about 2,000 pounds of bacteria, 2,000 pounds of actinomycetes, which are similar to bacteria, 6,000 pounds of fungi in a healthy acre pasture. And we've got earthworms, and we've got nematodes, and we've got other insects like dung beetles and so on and so on. If we add all these things up that are living in the soil, we've got about 7 tons of living things per acre in a healthy acre of pasture. I'm telling you this because the way we manage our pasture impacts not only the plant and the animal, but it's also impacting everything else living in that pasture soil. And that's important to realize. And that's a whole nother talk. So we're going to go on from here and talk a little bit more about soil fertility. I always like to start with Liebig's Law of the Minimum. And Liebig's Law of the Minimum says the level of plant production can be no greater than that allowed by the most limiting of essential plant growth factors. What's that mean? Well, there's lots of different plant growth factors or growth factors that can limit production. For example, nutrients like potassium or phosphorus or nitrogen can limit production. Soil acidity can limit production. Moisture, when it doesn't rain, can limit production. When it's too hot, cool season grasses won't grow. All these can impact pasture productivity. Whatever's the most limiting is going to hold pasture production back. Kind of think of it as a barrel. And in that barrel, the staves, whatever the lowest stave is going to limit how much water we can put in that barrel if we think of that water as pasture productivity. So what we have to do is identify what is our most limiting factor in terms of a soil fertility program, and then make that stave higher so that we can increase overall pasture production. So what makes a good soil for pastures? We want something that's deep, fertile, and well drained. Did I just describe what most pasture soils are? No, not usually. That's a row crop soil, right? Pastures are kind of relegated to the worst soils on the farm. Although I'd like to see more forages on deep, fertile, and well-drained soils in rotation with row crops. So a good pasture soil is going to have a high nutrient content and water holding capacity. And that's going to be a medium textured soil. So a loamy soil that has equal proportions of sand, silt, and clay will tend to hold the most plant available water. Clays will hold more water than a loam soil, but it holds it so tightly that the plants can't get the water off of that clay portion of the soil. You want high organic matter. You want it to be loose and porous, free of hard pans if we can get that. And you want to have high biological activity. So all those things we talked about, bacteria and fungi and earthworms, they're all important part of the soil because they help to cycle nutrients through that soil. So how do we determine how productive our soils are? Well, the NRCS has rated our soils from 1 to 8 and grouped them into what we call soil productivity groupings, with 1 being the most productive and 8 being the least productive. Generally speaking, if it's below 5 or below, it's not really suited for agricultural production. It's more of a forestry type soil. And then we also assess chemical characteristics of the soil like pH and phosphorus and potassium through soil testing. So this is just some productivity grouping data. And the reason I'm showing you this is that depending on how productive your soils are, can impact how you fertilize those soils. So if we have soils that are more productive and have more yield potential, they're going to require more nutrients to achieve that yield potential. And that's important to remember when we're dealing with really productive soils. So for example, a soil productivity grouping of 1 could produce greater than 6 tons of alfalfa orchard grass hay. If we compare that to a soil productivity grouping of 3, that's going to produce less than 4 tons. So we want to fertilize our soils that are more productive with higher amounts of soil because we have more potential productivity in those soils. So what kind of soil do you have? There's a great tool out there called the Web Soil Survey. You can get it at this web address. If you don't have access to the internet or you're not good at using a computer, then go into your extension office or your soil and water conservation office, and they'll help you determine what soils you have. This is a great tool because all you do is you go online, you put in your address, it takes you to the general area of your farm. You can zoom in and then figure out what pasture you want to know about or what field you want to know about. You draw a little box around it, and it gives you all the details in that soil. It tells you the productivity of that soil. It tells you the kind of soils that you have, how much of each of the different soils you have, and so on. All right. When we talk about soil fertility, we often talk about indicator plants. And those are plants that indicate something about that soil. Could be acidity, could be low fertility, could be poorly drained, but they're plants that grow in different places, and they can be good to look at indicator plants. And the most common one is broom sage, right? When we look at a broom sage field, we know that something's not quite right with the fertility in that field. A lot of times we'll say it needs lime, but in some cases it's not lime, it's low phosphorus. In many cases it's low phosphorus. So the point that I want to make is that probably the best way to determine soil fertility is just take a soil sample. It's $6 to get it tested in Kentucky. They're going to give you results back that quantifies the nutrients in the soil and allows you to develop a targeted fertility program for your farm. And then you want to sample every 2 to 3 years to kind of track the progress of your soil fertility. Soil acidity is a major factor limiting forage production in the southeastern United States. When I get a soil test back, the first thing I always look at is soil acidity. What's your soil pH? And it limits forage production through reduced nutrient availability in the soil and also through reduced nitrogen fixation in clovers and other legumes. Lime neutralizes soil acidity and also supplies calcium and magnesium. The general guideline that I kind of target people to for most improved pastures are 6 to 6.4. When we're at 6 to 6.4, we're in a place that we're going to encourage legume growth in those pastures and maximize nitrogen fixation in those legumes. If we look at a chart like this, these are the different nutrients in the soil. Where these bands are the widest means they're the most plant available. And if we draw a box around where we want to be at this 6 to 7 range, you'll see that most of our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, are the widest. So they're the most plant available. The point I want you to take home is if you have limited funds, and most of us do have limited funds to spend on soil fertility in our farms, if you take a soil test and you need lime, then it's your best buy for the dollar because it's not only neutralizing soil acidity, but it's making all these other nutrients more plant available in the soil. The other nutrients to target are the nutrients that are in the very low and low range primarily, because that's when we're going to get the most response to adding those nutrients to the system. So when we add fertilizer to a pasture that's in the very low and low range, we get a really good yield response as shown by this line. So we expect those nutrients are going to be deficient in that pasture, and we are going to get a significant yield increase. That yield increase tends to decrease as we get into the medium range, and by the time we get to the high range, we can add more of those nutrients, but we tend not to get an increase in yield once we get to this medium minus to high range. So this is the ideal spot to be at in a pasture. It's kind of teetering right between that medium plus and high range. And when we're here, chances are we're not limiting overall yield in terms of soil fertility in that given pasture. In reality, if we're in the medium range, we're doing pretty good. As we get towards the bottom of the medium range, we could be sacrificing a little bit of yield, but as we move towards the top of the medium range, chances are we're not going to see a big increase to additional fertilizer inputs into that system. I want to talk just a little bit about nutrient cycling in grassland ecosystems. One of the most beautiful things about well-managed pastures is that we don't remove a lot of nutrients from well-managed pastures. We've got inputs that come in. We've got fertilizer, manure, legumes, bringing nitrogen in. We've got feed resources, whether it's hay or concentrate feed, mineral supplements. Those are all inputs into our grassland ecosystem. And they get cycled around this grassland ecosystem, usually through the animal. So the animal will eat the forage that we produce, and about 80 to 90% of those nutrients that go in the front end come out the back end of the animal. And so it gets cycled around these pastures. And then our exports from this system, so nutrient exports would be in the form of primarily calves from this system. John Laurie at the University of Missouri did an estimate of nutrients removed by a cow-calf pair, and what he found was 7 pounds of P2O5 in a pound of potash. Not a lot of nutrients being removed from a grassland ecosystem because they're being recycled within this system. We put that on an acre basis, so we're stocked at 2 acres per cow-calf unit. It's even less nutrients being removed per acre. Now we have nutrient losses in other ways. We've got leaching of nutrients through the soil and so forth, but removal through the product we're producing is pretty low in a grassland ecosystem, and that makes a well-managed grassland ecosystem really sustainable in the long term. What can happen inside grazing systems is that we redistribute nutrients within that grazing system. So if we think about that for a minute, animals in a large continuous pasture will go out and they'll graze, and they'll come back to where? To shade and water usually, and they'll kind of hang out there, lay down, ruminate, and then they get hungry again, they get up and go out. What happens when they get up? They make a deposit, right? So over time, what happens is we pick nutrients up in the forage here, we bring them back, and we deposit them around shade and water sources, around places that we feed hay, mineral supplements, and so on, any place where animals congregate, we can actually transfer nutrients from one place in a pasture to another. It's always interesting when you look at a soil test where they actually went in and did a grid sampling. You can tell where they fed hay at and where animals congregate at because the nutrient concentrations are just much higher in those areas. So what do? Well, we can subdivide these pastures, we can install some waterers in these pastures, and we can put these animals in these smaller cells or paddocks. And when we put them in there, we make them eat there, drink there, and deposit their nutrients there. And so with rotational stocking, one of the benefits is we get a more even nutrient distribution throughout that grazing system. One of the things I always like to mention is nutrient removal in hay. So if we're making hay, we're removing nutrients from that hay field. And it can be significant quantities of nutrients. For example, a ton of orchard grass has 50 pounds of nitrogen in it, 17 pounds of phosphorus, and about 60 pounds of potash. Well, you're saying that doesn't sound like a lot in a ton of orchard grass. Well, say I had a good year. And I produced 4 tons of orchard grass hay on that pasture. 4 times 60, all of a sudden we're looking at removing 240 pounds of potash per acre. That's got to go back on that field to maintain productivity long term. So if you've got pastures that you're haying within your system, it's important to get those nutrients back onto that pasture. So if we look at just the value of nutrients in a ton of hay, each ton of hay is going to remove around $35 worth of nutrients. And that's my assumptions above there for the cost of the nutrients and the amount of nutrients in there. But each ton of hay is going to remove about $35 worth of nutrients. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because if you consider buying hay, especially if you're not a huge operator, buying hay instead of making it yourself, and you can get a good quality hay source, you're kind of getting a coupon with that hay, right? Because you're bringing those nutrients into your grazing system. Now, it's not the same as putting a commercial fertilizer on, but over time you can bring nutrients into your system with that feed source. All right, so how we feed that hay can impact the value of those nutrients. If we feed it all in one place right beside the gate, which is easiest to do, then we tend to concentrate the nutrients there. Ideally, we want to move those feeding points around the pasture. And when we move those feeding points around, we tend to spread those nutrients out around that pasture. How am I doing on time? Okay, pretty close. So I'm going to move on here. Talk just a little bit about legumes and grazing systems because they're a very important part of a healthy grassland ecosystem because they're bringing nitrogen in. Rhizobium bacteria infect the roots of legume plants and they form a symbiotic relationship. And those little pinkish nodules are where those rhizobium bacteria live. And they take nitrogen from the air and fix it into a plant available form. So right now the air we're breathing, 78% nitrogen, but it's not available to the plant. The legumes are taking that gaseous nitrogen and making it into a form that plants can use. And they have important impacts. One is they increase productivity of grassland ecosystems, but for us, it dilutes the endophyte and tall fescue when we include clover in our pastures in Kentucky. And I'm going to let you look at this in your proceedings, but this is the value of the nitrogen fixed by different legumes. Different legumes will fix different amounts of nitrogen. And we can put a number value depending on the nitrogen price on there. One thing I do want to share is that most of the sharing of nitrogen between a grass and a legume plant in a pasture is indirect sharing. So it's from ingestion and so the animal eats that legume plant and then it deposits that nitrogen in the form of dung and urine in that pasture and it's cycled through that grass or through that nutrient cycle. Also through death and decomposition of plant parts, roots, shoots, and nodules will break down and release nutrients into that grassland ecosystem. Little direct transfer of nitrogen. We kind of talked about this already, so I'm going to skip on because Ray's standing up here into my last slide. So when we talk about an integrated weed control program in pastures, we need to think about selecting and growing adapted forage species, setting a sustainable stocking rate. It's one of the most important parts of a successful grazing system is getting that stocking rate right. Looking at rotationally stocking our pastures, maintaining good soil fertility within our grazing system, clipping our pastures as needed as part of a weed control strategy before plants go to seed, and then using herbicides when needed to control difficult weeds within grazing systems. And I'll just leave you with this thought. A successful weed management program in pastures requires an integrated approach that includes all the soil, the plant, and the animal. And that's really what this conference is about today, is incorporating all three of those things into a successful weed control program. And the judicial use of herbicides for those really difficult weeds within grazing systems. All right, with that, I'm done. Only 6 minutes over. So